Hello, my name is James E. I go by Jim Tinner, CBO. I've been asked by the Northwest chapter of the American Institute of Building Design to provide a 2018 International Residential Code Update class for its members. That'll be the subject of today's presentation. I hope you all have PowerPoint. The original intent was to have this in person as a traditional class. However, as we all know, with COVID-19, that's no longer feasible for the foreseeable future. Instead, we'll be using a narrated PowerPoint presentation to highlight the significant changes of the 2018 IRC. This presentation is tailored to building designers, so it does not include items that would not affect your designs. There are several significant changes that affect inspectors, but those are outside the scope of this presentation, so are not included. A little about myself. I spent 30 years in building code enforcement, the last 20 of which were in the capacity of building official for 3 different jurisdictions. Prior to that, I was a building inspector and fire prevention inspector. I hold a degree in building construction technology and have taught classes for the Washington Association of Building Officials and the Internet Code Council, as well as a few industry trade organizations such as yours. I've even designed a few homes, one of which was awarded Design of the Year by the Lower Columbia Contractors Association. I served for the building official representative on the Washington State Building Code Council for 5 years, as well as a member of the ICC Plumbing Mechanical Fuel Gas Code Committee for about the same amount of time. I've also served on the Washington State Emergency Management Council, which almost 20 years ago designed the protocols that most of us are currently living under due to COVID-19. Please write contact information and feel free to email or call me if you have questions after the presentation. My email address is j.tinner@comcast.net. My cell phone number is 425-761-6150. The effective date of the 2018 and other ICC codes has been delayed a couple of times due to COVID and are now set to take effect February 1st, 2021. It's important to note that the building permit application, if you want to stay on the 2015 series of codes, needs to be submitted by the end of January next year. It's the date of submission that sets what codes you're on. It's important to note that the application needs to be complete. Part of what is complete is defined by state law, and each city can amend that to make more requirements. In other words, you can't turn in something on a paper napkin and accept it to be vested under the 2015 codes. There is no statutory requirement for the State Building Code Council to adopt each edition of the codes. They do so by choice to keep abreast of the latest building technologies. The State Building Code Council also amends the existing codes. As an example, the 2015 IRC was retroactively amended to allow for cross-laminated timber because it was considered the best, most modern technology, and we should avail that to the designers and the builders. The next slide is a video of Brockett Commons, the tallest wood building in the world, being erected. It was erected by 9 people in little over 2 months after the concrete podium and stairways were put in. The reason for the concrete stairways, one of the disadvantages of cross-laminated timbers, it's too stiff. So in a major earthquake, people on the upper floors would be beat to death. So they left the building fairly ductile, and lateral support is provided by the concrete stairways because, believe it or not, the concrete is capable of moving a lot more than the CLT is. The allowances on this slide come from an original interpretation requested by the city of Spokane. In the SBC deliberations on the matter, it was brought out that short-term rentals were actually hotels and motels and governed under the building code rather than the IRC, unless they were owner-occupied. Hotels and motels require fire sprinklers, therefore Airbnb and similar vacation rentals require fire sprinklers. Several jurisdictions are going after Airbnb and similar businesses for not providing fire sprinklers in their short-term rentals. The reason is that short-term rentals take those dwellings off of the long-term rental market, therefore driving up the cost of rental housing. This slide is fairly self-explanatory, although may be interpreted differently by various jurisdictions. The SBC discussions on the issue, it was agreed that such buildings should fall under the scope of projects that building designers could design. Care facilities, as shown in the previous slide, must be provided with NFPA 13D, that's single-family sprinklers. Lodging houses, as long as they're owner-occupied and meet the limitations of previous slides, do not have to be fire sprinklered. This table provides an easy cross-reference between the 2015 and 2018 IBC code sections regarding occupancies previously listed. Please keep in mind that Washington State amendments that were discussed on previous slides. Alternate materials or methods of construction have always been allowed by the codes. While the building official is not required to approve alternates, they must provide a reason for denial when requested. The IRC has a new definition of ready access. This usually applies to plumbing fixtures. The Uniform Plumbing Code, UPC, also has definitions accessible and readily accessible, which are fairly the same as the IRC definition shown. Regarding plumbing fixtures, in case of a conflict, the UPC would govern. Washington State has amended the IRC to include the definition of balanced whole house ventilation. Typically, the details for balanced whole house ventilation would be provided by the mechanical contractor. However, with more and more jurisdictions issuing combination permits, it may be required that documentation for such systems be provided at the same time as the building permit documents. Detailed requirements for those systems can be found in State Amendment M 1505.4.1.4. Typically, combustion air for items such as fireplace would be needed to be calculated in the balanced whole house ventilation system, but intermittent items such as bathroom exhaust, laundry exhaust, kitchen exhaust would not be included. There has been a lot of confusion over the years as to how fire separation distance is calculated. Some jurisdictions use the face of the foundation wall, while others use the face of the exterior wall. Imagine using the foundation wall when you have a 2-foot cantilever extending closer to the property line. That just doesn't make sense. The new definition clarifies this to include either based on which one is closest to either the property line or an assumed property line between two buildings. Another new definition in the IRC is sleeping loss. Such spaces were previously not recognized in the IRC. We'll talk about the detailed requirements for sleeping lofts a little bit later. Previously, a townhouse unit had to be completely open to yards or courts on 2 or more sides. This has now changed so that the 2 or more sides only need to be open for 50% of their length to open courts or yards. Projections such as eaves, decks, or balconies, which were within required fire separation distance, had to be fire resistance rated in accordance with ASTM E119 or UL 263, which are tested and listed assemblies. The code now allows non-rated assemblies as found in IBC section 721 or calculated fire resistance as shown in IBC 722. The 2015 IRC did not allow 2 one-hour walls to separate townhouse units unless the building was provided with fire sprinklers. Washington State had amended the requirements so that fire sprinklers were not required when using 2 one-hour walls between townhouse units. Because several other states did not require fire sprinklers in townhouses, the Washington Association of Building Officials, WABO, proposed and was successful at removing the fire sprinkler requirement in the national code. In duplexes, the IRC now allows calculated or generic fire resistance for the 1 hour wall separating those units. Those, again, are found in IBC sections 721 and 722. IBC section 703.3 guides us back to IBC section 721 and 722 for either calculated or generic fire resistance. Ceiling lighting installed within a 1 hour assembly in duplexes used to need to be protected by 1 hour blankets or drywall boxes. Designers and inspectors often overlook this requirement. 1 hour fire-rated ceiling lights are now available, and the IRC now recognize these listed can lights. I recommend that when you specify can lights in 1 hour rated ceilings that you call out the requirement for 1 hour listed fixtures. Of course, this doesn't apply to townhomes, as a townhome has to be 1 unit from the ground to the sky, so there's nothing above it. Automatic closing devices are typically either magnetic closers or more recently mechanical closers that have hit the market. While the IRC does not specify how automatic closers are to be activated, it's assumed that the activation will be by a smoke alarm within the dwelling unit. Automatic closing devices hold the door between the dwelling and the garage in the open position, allowing ease of access between the two for movement of furniture, groceries, or other items. This change language is simply clarification of what the code had always intended and probably will rarely, if ever, affect the design of your buildings. The change in vertical rise in the IRC is intended to give more flexibility in your design to meet actual real-world conditions. This change is fairly straightforward. They've simply added electrical appliances to the items that would invoke protection of the floor or ceiling above in crawl spaces or unfinished basements. Of course, no protection is required in a sprinkler building. Because tempered glass breaks into small pieces and falls from its holding when broken, it provides no actual protection from fall. Where laminated glass does provide protection to fall, it'll generally stay in place. Therefore, when tempered glass is used, a top rail is required on a guard. When laminated glass is used, a top rail is not required. The IRC now recognizes that egress windows from basement bedrooms are no longer required when the entire dwelling is equipped with fire sprinklers. Remember, that's the entire dwelling. Although you still do need 2 ways out of the basement in this scenario, one which has to be directly to the exterior of the building. A new exception to the handrail projection limitations provides for adequate clearance behind the handrail when it passes a projection of a floor, landing, or tread return. That projection can be up to 6.5 inches. This change is simply a clarification stating that when walking surfaces are more than 30 inches above grade, a guard is required. Please note that the term grade is defined in IRC Chapter 2, and that definition talks about finished ground level adjacent to the walking surface. There is a conflict in the code language, as IRC Section 312.1.1 states that guards will be provided whenever the walking surface is within 36 inches horizontally of a floor or ground below. That is more than 30 inches below the walking surface, a guard will be provided. The IRC has removed the allowance not to interconnect smoke alarms in existing buildings due to infeasibility. During the ICC code hearings on the issue, it was determined that with radio-based smoke alarms, the exception was not necessary. Washington State has amended this section to not require interconnection of new smoke alarms in existing buildings where existing smoke alarms are not interconnected or where new smoke alarms are not capable of being interconnected with existing smoke alarms. There are two basic types of heat detectors. There are rate of rise detectors, which tell how fast the temperature is rising, will set off an alarm. Or there are the ionization type, which works a lot more like a smoke alarm. Either one is acceptable, but they do need to be installed in all attached garages now. In areas designated as coastal A zones, and please check with your building department on that, there are now specific design requirements to prevent damage from storm surge or extremely high tides. The requirement for slabs, pools, pool decks, and walkways to be structurally independent from other structures has been eliminated from the IRC. These exceptions evolved from research in large jurisdictions, primarily in the southwest United States, Austin, Houston, Los Angeles, and Honolulu. City of Bellingham was the first jurisdiction in Washington to adopt this list of exceptions, followed soon after by the City of Bellevue, not too much longer by City of Seattle, and eventually statewide through a State Building Code Council code change. The intent was to reduce the cost of the PV systems by eliminating the need for engineering. Several jurisdictions also do not include the value of the PV systems in their building permit valuations, thereby reducing permit fees when PV systems are installed. Please keep in mind these exceptions only apply to IRC buildings due to the structural redundancies inherent in the design of such buildings. The International Fire Code, IFC, has pathway requirements for roofs with PV systems. The clear pathway requirements in the IFC are to allow rooftop firefighting ventilation techniques. These are typically 36 inches inward from the exterior walls, but may vary with each jurisdiction. Bellingham, as example, did not adopt the pathway requirements because they do not use rooftop firefighting techniques, but rather create front and rear openings in the exterior walls and then use fans to ventilate the structure. This is not a change in Washington State, as the State Building Code Council created the 50% rule for sprinkler buildings in the 2015 IRC. The WABO Technical Code Committee proposed a nationwide change in the IRC, and it was adopted into the 2018 IRC. This is another conflict between a state amendment and the IRC. The state amendment is found in IRC Section 326, while the generic IRC language for habitable attics is found in IRC Section 325.6. The state amendment adds to the generic IRC requirements. The habitable attic in the state amendment must be in a sprinkler building, and the habitable attic must be no larger than 50% the floor area of the room below. This Washington State amendment is misnumbered as IRC Section 327, provides requirements for stationary storage battery systems. It was not the intent of the State Building Code Council to replace stationary storage battery system requirements with sleeping loft requirements. A more appropriate code section for the sleeping lofts would have been IRC Section 328, which currently does not exist in the IRC. I'm sure it'll get caught over the next year or two, and that'll probably be changed through another code amendment. With the advent of Simpson strong-tie Z-Max connectors, hot-dipped galvanized fasteners are generally required. Such connectors will meet the requirements of IRC R507.2. However, if you wish to specify something different, IRC Table R507.2.3 provides applicable standards for all deck connectors, regardless of what type. A new table has been added to the 2018 IRC detailing deck footing requirements. This section in the 2015 IRC regulated composite plastic deck materials. Those requirements have been moved to IRC Section 507.2.2. Live loads for decks and balconies have been a conflict between codes for the last several years. The IRC until recently required a 40 pound per square foot live load for decks and a 30 PSF live load for decks serving bedrooms only. The IBC and ASCE 7 required the deck live load for residential to be 1.5 times the live load of the occupancy served. That worked out to 60 pounds for residential decks and 45 pounds for decks serving only bedrooms. City of Seattle proposed a code change to align the various codes. That change was simply to require 60 PSF live load for all residential decks. The proposal passed at the ICC committee action hearings held in Richmond, Virginia. It again passed at the full membership hearings in Columbus, Ohio. ICC created an online voting platform not long ago called CDP, meaning Code Development Process, CDP Access, where members who could not attend out-of-state meetings could still vote on proposed code changes. The CDP Access voting takes place after the in-person vote at the membership hearings. After the 60 PSF change was approved at the code hearings, Seattle proposed the change retroactively for the 2015 IRC. The State Building Code Council agreed, so in Washington we have a 60 PSF live load for residential decks. During the CDP access voting, the proposed change failed on a national level. However, Washington decided to keep the change in our codes. Seattle was gracious enough in allowing their structural engineering staff to create a series of tables for the 60-pound live load. Those tables are found in the Washington State Amendments. Earlier versions of the IRC limited wood stud heights to 10 feet between lateral supports. A new table was added to the 2018 IRC allowing up to 12-foot stud heights between lateral supports, provided the limitations of the table are met. IRC Table R602.7, number 2, has been revised in its entirety. Girder and header spans are updated to assume number 2 southern pine rather than number 1 southern pine as used in the 2015 IRC. A footnote was added to clarify that headers and girders are assumed to be braced. For headers with pony walls above, a further reduction in span is taken for 2x8 or larger headers. IRC Table R602.10 has been monkeyed with every code cycle since the original 2000 IRC. We can all breathe a sigh of relief that the changes in the 18 IRC are almost insignificant. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion about fasteners or ties being able to support masonry veneer when the fastener or tie has to penetrate 2 inches of foam insulation before encountering structural sheathing. The concern was the weight of the veneer bending or withdrawing the fastener or tie. Testing showed that properly installed veneer was not a problem for gravity loads, so the concern was limited mainly to overturning forces and lateral loading. Testing determined that the veneer installed per the new IRC Table R703.8.4, number 2, would not create issues for either gravity loads, lateral loads, or overturning forces. The intent behind this change is that the net free area of the termination be close to the same square inches as the 4-inch dryer duct. A 4.5-inch termination with bars or grills intended to keep birds or vermin out may not meet this requirement. I think it's a good idea to note this requirement on the building plans. This last item that might impact the design of your buildings is that dryer ducts cannot be deformed. A 4-inch dryer duct in a 2x4 wall cavity would require deformation in at least part of the duct. Accordingly, the duct, when installed in a wall cavity, must be installed in a 2x6 wall. Please keep in mind that the Washington State Energy Code does not allow any duct to displace required insulation, so dryer ducts must not be installed in exterior walls.